use of vocabulary is ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, including theoretical terms introduced by scientists in describing things. But the claim here that in passage 4, although describing and explaining are distinguishable, they are in an important sense inseparable. The descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand. And then next, to make first-hand use of these modal expressions is to be about the business of explaining a state of affairs or justifying an assertion. Now, this is speaking a little bit loosely, but he's saying the moves, the language moves that correspond to or are licensed by implication relations, what you're doing when you make one of those moves is justifying another claim or explaining another claim. So relations of justification and explanation. These are, we saw, he wants to say, material implication relations. That is, they articulate the contents of non-logical concepts. He doesn't say that logically good implications articulate the contents of logical concepts, but that's a natural thing to think. Then the claim just is, it's the implication relations governing some expression that articulate its meaning. So in 12, when he says the meaning of a linguistic symbol as a linguistic symbol is entirely constituted by the rules which regulate its use, those rules include rules that codify implication relations. And if those are logical implication relations, then it's logical content they're articulating. And if it's non-logical content that they're articulating, then they're material implication relations. So the piece that he's adding to the puzzle in talking about description here is that those implication relations are subjunctively robust or counterfactual supporting. And that's essential both to their function in explanation and to their function in justification. Some implications are more subjunctively robust than others. The idea of a law of nature is of a principle of inference that is subjunctively robust no matter what additional auxiliary hypotheses you add to it. It may be that there aren't any laws of nature in that sense. That's sort of projecting the notion of there being different ranges of subjunctive robustness to the limit and saying, no, F equals MA no matter what else is true. That's aspirational, and obviously it's been of a great significance in the history of science to have modalities like that in play. I'd recommend Nancy Cartwright's How the Laws of Physics Lie, and Mark Lang's book on Laws of Nature, to understand the relation between statements like that and the actual subjunctive conditionals that you use in scientific reasoning, which have to be hedged about in many ways. Mark Wilson also assembles a variety of considerations that undercut that notion of a law of nature. Sellars is still thinking there's laws of nature behind every true subjunctive conditional. That isn't, I think, the way we would think about it today, typically, Tom.
So just trying to get a grip on this idea of the different kinds of content. So is the thought that in a given concept there's different kinds of content, like logical content and material content, something like that? So copper, for example, I'm trying. I don't get what the logical content of copper would
Look,
be.
there are conjunctive concepts, for instance.
Right, okay.
And so there's going to be some things follow just because it's a conjunctive concept.
Okay.
But I mean, the other thought was that physical facts are going to stand to one another in physical implicational relations, and nautical facts will stand to each other in nautical implicational relations. That to talk about a vocabulary, nautical, culinary, physical, and so on, is to talk not just about the words, but about a restricted range of implications.
Right.
So, things that are describable in nautical vocabulary could also be describable in aesthetic vocabulary. Oh, look at the beautiful yawl. But the implications are going to be different depending on which characterization of that you use. Okay. So his picture is that every empirical concept, everything you can use everything that can occur essentially in an empirical description, has with it a class of implications that articulate its content, its conceptual content. And those implications are material implications, that is, you're not going to be able to derive them all from the laws of logic, because these are empirical concepts that we're talking about. And they're all going to come with ranges of subjunctive robustness. Now this view has implications which are epitomized in the title of that essay that I mentioned earlier, though we didn't read it, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. As I say, he still thought, as basically everybody did then, that if you've got a subjunctive conditional, there's got to be a law standing behind it, even though it's the subjunctive conditionals that he focuses on. But every empirical concept has to be involved in some subjunctively robust implications. So I think I mentioned when we were reading the CDCM essay that if you look at the ranges of subjunctive robustness, I was talking about the laws as being at one end, where there's maximally subjunctively robust, let's say. At the minimal end, the medieval philosopher Abelard talked about hic et nunc. Well, I'm going to say inferences, but I'm not sure what word. Consequences, hic et nunc, consequentia is what he said. Where he's saying, look, this conclusion follows from this premise. As long as, here and now, that's the hic et nunc. If anything were different in the entire world, the consequence wouldn't follow. But given everything that's true right now, it follows. And Sellars wants to say, probably not intelligible as a notion. Ryle, in his classic essay, If So and Because, says implications come with a built-in generality. So his example, he gives a couple of them, but one of them is, today's Wednesday, so tomorrow will be Thursday. So even though there's no quantifier in that, in saying that's a good inference, you're implicitly committing yourself to its being good as an instance of a pattern that has other instances. And that's a way of talking about how other things could be different and the inference would still go through. Now this view, which I think is obviously correct, you don't understand the concept of a lion unless you know things like that lions don't just pop in and out of existence, that being struck by lightning would be really bad for one, that if it were hungry it needs to eat, unless you have some grip, not just on what follows from being a lion, but what else that would turn on. So you say, well, the lion's hungry, so he'll chase that wounded gazelle. And you say, well, now wait a bit, he's in East Africa. If this branch had just broken off a tree in China, would the lion still chase the gazelle? And you have to have a sense, no, that probably wouldn't make any difference. Unless you know things like that, you don't know what a lion is. But this view has consequences that Sellars is aware of, but like so many of these things, we seem to keep forgetting. Again, I'm repeating a point I'd made before. The way people thought about Kripkean possible worlds semantics, empiricists who'd been impressed by Quine saying that modal logic only engendered an illusion of understanding of modal notions and subjunctive conditionals. Quine making fun of talk about possibilia, saying, well, it's possible that we are all stuck in this room because there's a fat man stuck in the door and blocking it. Well, exactly how fat is he, and how tall is he, and what shirt is he wearing? Let's talk about possibility. You think you understand it, but you don't really. And the thought was, well, Quine says he understands extensional vocabulary, where all you need to know to understand it is what it actually applies to, the extension of it. So, for instance, shapes and colors, I think, are like that. So he's happy enough with describing this world with these, in effect, labels, and saying, okay, there's a world and it has a red sphere in the world. And that's okay, because it's not talking about what's possible or what's necessary or any modally funny stuff. And now Kripke and Lewis and Stolnicker and the folk tell us, well, if you give me possible worlds specified in purely extensional vocabulary, no modal vocabulary involved at all, now I can describe a universe of those possible worlds with relations between them, but I'm just describing it in a purely extensional meta language. And now I can tell you that besides the extensional properties that things have, which you can tell that they have and understand entirely in terms of what's true in this world, I can show you how to introduce modal vocabulary and say what's possible and necessary in this world, and even what subjunctive conditionals are true in this world, by looking at what's true in neighboring worlds. So if you want to know if P were true in this world, it's not, counterfactual supposition, would Q be true, then we have a similarity metric on relations between these worlds, look at the nearest P worlds and see whether all the nearest P worlds are Q worlds. And if they are, then the subjunctive conditional, if P, the counterfactual indeed conditional, if P were true, then Q would be, is true here in this world. And now there's no funny business about this because I've done all this just in terms of extensional descriptions of each world and an extensional meta language describing the constellation of worlds. So you see, guys who are skeptical about modality, we can make sense of it in completely non-modal terms. But not if Sellars is right. If Sellars is right, to say that something is a sphere or a cube is not an extensional property in the sense that you can understand it entirely in terms of what's true in this world. Being a lion isn't like that. Any empirical property has got modal necessary conditions. Unless it would behave in certain ways, it's not a sphere. Unless, if you correctly counted its corners, you got 8, it's not a cube. Sellars is claiming that any empirical property, for something to have it in this world, things about other neighboring worlds have to be true. Those are the things that make true what would be true of it if. And it can't be a lion or a cube or red unless those subjunctive conditionals are true. Now, this is not saying that thinking about possible worlds isn't useful for many reasons. It's saying you can't think about it as though you could specify each of the worlds in non-modal terms and then get an independent account of modality by giving this extensional meta language of accessibility and similarity relations among the worlds. To talk about any one world is already committing you to a whole lot of modal claims about that world. Otherwise, it just isn't a lion that's in that world, unless it were true that it would be bad for it to be struck by lightning and it would still chase the gazelle if that branch in the tree had been broken in China and so on. So, rethinking then how we think about, say, possible worlds in the light of this intimate connection between description and explanation, and so between the applicability of an empirical predicate and the truth of these subjunctive conditionals, this is philosophically significant. Okay, so that's another line that I wanted to say. His thinking about the descriptive character as the descriptive uses of language as. So he's got a philosophically rich story about description and representation that has consequences like the argument against the myth of the given on the one hand, and this account of modal relations going all the way down. There aren't any non-modal empirical properties, is the claim. And I said, he has this bold, I described it as heroic, aspiration to assimilate all of the non-descriptive, non-representational uses of language under the rubric of metalinguistic. See them as having metalinguistic expressive roles, which you can understand that metalinguistic as, in order to understand the use of these expressions, you have to understand the use of some other expressions, the expressions that these are in some sense about. Whereas the core expressions, the descriptive empirical vocabulary, you don't need to understand the use of any other kind of vocabulary. We're holists about them, so you can't just understand one empirical concept. You got to understand a bunch of them and subjunctively robust relations among them. But there isn't any other vocabulary, other kind of vocabulary that you have to understand the use of to understand the use of these. That's ground level sort of object language use. But everything else he's saying, he wants to think of every other kind of expressive role as one that, in order to understand the use of these, in this sense, metalinguistic expressions, there is some other kind of vocabulary that you have to understand the use of. He even thinks, I think, and this is another sort of substantive commitment, that it can be the same other vocabulary for all of them. That is, they're all metalinguistic relative to the use of ordinary empirical descriptive representational vocabulary. And that's again a development of a Kantian point. They're all categorial relative to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, the vocabulary of science. So that's still front and center for him, that vocabulary, because all the other respectable vocabularies are intelligible only in terms of the expressive role they play with respect to the use of that ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, including the theoretical terms of the natural sciences. So this is an overarching sort of philosophical, systematic view that he's got that obliges him to do, a lot of work thinking about the scientific vocabulary and thinking about these other expressive, broadly metalinguistic things. Now, I complained that though he introduces and uses the notion of a pragmatic metalanguage in the early work, he's of two minds about it. In one of the early essays, he says, people talk about pragmatic metalanguages, but there aren't really any such things. If you properly understand them as semantic metalanguages, that's good enough. But by the very next essay that he writes, he's saying, well, people have been bandying about this notion of pragmatic metalanguage. It's an okay notion if we don't think of it as purely descriptive. That's would be psychologistic. Psychologism is descriptivism applied to the use of some vocabulary. Remember I mentioned this bon mot of Stanley Cavell, that Kant de-psychologized epistemology, Frege de-psychologized logic, and Wittgenstein de-psychologized psychology. The de-psychologizing is realizing that you have to use a normative vocabulary, a normative meta-vocabulary, in order to specify the use of these expressions. And so Sellars says in these passages 13 and 14 that you need to use a pragmatic meta-language that's not an empirical science of sign behavior, but is a branch of the formal theory of language, which he's been talking about. The formal theory is in a normative vocabulary of rules. It's only in that way that the analytic philosopher can hope to give a non-psychologistic account of the key concepts of traditional epistemology. So I'm saying that's good Kantian doctrine, but he's bringing that up to date in the new way of words. And then philosophical propositions are propositions in the pure theory of language that is the pure syntax of pragmatic meta-languages. That's the pure theory. And I pointed out that a way to think about the problem he was wrestling with in wanting to stretch the notion of a meta-language to do the work with respect to phenomenal vocabulary, semantic vocabulary, ontological, categorical vocabulary, and modal vocabulary that he does, is that what he needed was the notion of pragmatic meta-language that he has here, because in each case, think about Look's talk was the first one we looked at in detail. He really tells us what you're doing when you say how things merely look, that what you're doing is withholding a commitment while still evincing the temptation to apply it. He tells us what you're doing in saying that all A's are necessarily B's is endorsing a pattern of subjunctively robust reasoning. What you're doing in saying that triangularity is a property is functionally classifying is triangular as a one-place predicate. That it's natural to think of the notion of metalinguistic that he needs as pragmatic meta-language. And we see him committed to a principle that if we use this this distinction that he gave us, we can put by saying, well, he thinks that you can draw semantic conclusions from pragmatic premises. So, from the fact that you couldn't learn to speak Look's talk unless you already could speak is-fi talk, because you have to be able to undertake the commitment in order to withhold the commitment, that's a pragmatic dependence. You couldn't learn to use this expression, obey the rules that articulate the meaning of this expression without learning to use these others. That's a kind of conceptual dependence. It means that looks read is conceptually dependent on is read. That's drawing a semantic conclusion about dependence relation among concepts or conceptual contents from the pragmatic view. And I think we can understand the arguments that he gives and the analytic achievement that he has in terms of that notion of pragmatic metavocabulary. But for some reason, he doesn't appeal to it. I don't know, starting in the middle 50s, already doesn't in EPM, and never really does again. So one of the puzzles I had is sort of, why is that? It seems like it was just what he needed. Okay, so what I've done so far is an overview of, I guess, two dimensions, the sort of inside the descriptive function of empirical language and outside it. Now, he also has this idea that the pragmatics is essentially normative, that it's a matter of rules. Sometimes he's not so explicit about that. He isn't, interestingly, in EPM. In EPM, we 36ers, point to the to passage 2 here in characterizing an episode or a state of knowing, or of believing, or of judging. We're not giving an empirical description. We're placing it in the logical space of reasons, justifying and being able to justify implication and explanation. But that's a normative space. It's a space of rules, he said before. But in EPM, he talks about it being epistemic, rather than its being normative. And rules only get mentioned sort of in passing. By epistemic, he could, I think it would have been clearer for him to have said conceptual. It's a matter of the application of concepts. That's the notion that he needed, only that narrower notion, not the notion of rules in general, in order to make the argument against the myth of the given. That only what's conceptually contentful can provide evidence for other beliefs, and you can't have any evidence like that unless you can make all the moves in the vicinity of it. You don't count as having grasped the concept. Grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word, and that includes the kind of know-how. That's passage 11, knowing a language is knowing how, as opposed to knowing that, Ryle's terms, knowing how to make the moves, how to assess the moves. So some places he's more explicit about the broader normative rule-governed thing. Other places he just talks about being epistemic or conceptual, but that's a special case. That's where the rules in question are the rules that articulate the space of reasons. Okay. But there's another place that he goes sort of with this account of the descriptive and explanatory dimension of language, and that's to the primacy of science. That's expressed in the Scientia Mensura passage in the dimension of describing and explaining the world. Not everything we do with language, right, is about the other story, but there, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. Scientia Mensura. And here, Sellars has a number of wonderful things to teach us about science. One that is absolutely rock solid for him is his scientific realism about theoretical entities. So remember here the slogan is that the distinction between observable and theoretical entities is not an ontological distinction, it's a methodological or epistemological distinction. It's a distinction not of kinds of things, but of modes of access to them. And a theoretical entity is one that, at a certain stage in inquiry, our only mode of epistemic access to it, the only way we can become entitled to claims about it, is as the conclusion of an inference. Any empirical claim, you have to be able also to arrive at it as a conclusion of an inference. But some you can also arrive at non-inferentially. So this is of a piece with his critique of the myth of the given, distinguish two senses of non-inferential. One, non-inferential would be it has the content that it has independently of any inferences that it's involved in. And he wants to say nothing is contentful in that non-inferential sense. To be conceptually contentful is to be inferentially articulated, but once you can make all the moves, the language moves, once your concepts have content because they're situated in a space of implications, you can, for some of the positions, arrive at them not by an inferential move, not by a language move, but by a language entry transition. And those are non-inferential in origin. Nothing is non-inferential in content. But some things, some positions, you can only arrive at inferentially. But that's a matter of our epistemic access to them. He rejects what he calls the Platonic principle, which wants to read our ontology off of our epistemology and divide things into different kinds of things based on our mode of access to them. He's thinking of Plato, thinking of objects of sense as being fundamentally different from objects of intellect. And he's saying, no, think of these as just different modes of access. And his big argument for this is that the line can shift. It's historically mutable and variable. What started off life with us only having inferential access to it can later on become something that we can observe. So you shouldn't draw those ontological conclusions from these methodological distinctions. Nothing is in principle unobservable. It's only de facto unobservable. So the enemy here is instrumentalism that says only concepts articulated, only claims articulated in terms of observable concepts are true and false. These other postulates are just calculational devices to get us back and forth from observables to observables. He says fundamental mistake. But that claim's very different from the Scientia Mensura. It's very different from the claim of the primacy of the scientific image, which seems to be that from PSIM at the end of this period, seems to be a filling in of the thought from the Scientia Mensura from section 41 of EPM in 1956. That's a different thought. And I complained about this thought that it seemed to me insufficiently clearly articulated and insufficiently argued for. But is it false? Is there nothing to it? Well, it depends on sort of how you clarify it. Here's 6 things that I think are in play in this thought of Sellars. He's more explicit 3 years later in his Locke lectures, his 65 Locke lectures, Science and Metaphysics, where he says, look, Kant has this distinction between phenomena and noumena. And I'm going to give you an up-to-date version of that. And it's something like the distinction between what the theory of science tells us there is and what we, the way those things appear to us. So he explicitly invokes Eddington's 2 tables. The table as the science in 1919 told us it was, but it was still tiny particles vibrating really fast, colorless, mostly space, most of it empty, and Eddington saying the solid colored stationary table that we see, that's just an appearance of what science tells us there really is. I think I called this invidious Eddingtonian theoretical realism. It's invidious because he's saying what's real, that's the honorific, is the result of our theoretical, is expressed by our theoretical descriptions, not the observations that you can make of it. And I think Sellars would say, don't think of any of these as, in the first instance, ontological distinctions. Think of them all as methodological. The manifest image vocabulary, not all of it, but the part that's descriptive and explanatory, is all the way the scientific, what's expressed by the scientific descriptions and explanations shows up for us. And he wants to treat the deliverances of science as the reality that those manifest image level descriptions and explanations are an appearance of. A partly veridical appearance, but a partly mistaken experience as well. And I think one of the reasons it's hard to pin Sellars down on exactly how he's thinking about the relation, exactly how he's thinking of the privilege of scientific description and explanation over non-scientific description and explanation, is that different lines of thought sort of correspond to these different distinctions. And I want to say these are 6 different distinctions. Insofar as one is running back and forth between them, one is making a mistake. So for instance, in Kant, it would be a howler to identify the phenomenal with appearance. Phenomenal objects have appearances, but he uses appearance sort of entirely within the empirical realm, and it's only transcendentally that you could say the phenomenal realm is an appearance of the noumenal realm. I recently read a Kant dissertation on the distinction between phenomena and appearances in Kant. Sellars does want to say that it's the theoretical postulates, anyway, of ultimate science that give us the things in themselves. That's the bit of Kant that he's working with in there. The phenomenal noumenal, that's Greek, derived for thinking about the things that are knowable by sense and the things that are knowable only by intellect, except that's not the way Kant uses them. Phenomenal things include the deliverances of Newtonian science. Mass and force are phenomenal, part of the phenomenal world. And yet we know about them by intellect as well as sense. They're theoretical entities, but part of the phenomenal world. So this is just sort of a conjecture that various lines of thought in the vicinity of so he insofar as he's lining these up, the privilege he's talking about is all the things on the right. Science is going to give us the real things, the things in themselves. Those are the noumenal things. A little bit iffy, but yeah, it's the theoretical deliverances. This is the Edingtonian side. That is the things that are only knowable about by inference. That are the real things. So that any of our manifest image observational terms could, turn out not to be right. I think sort of sorting out what's right and what's not right about this privileging of the descriptive and explanatory resources of the natural sciences is a matter of distinguishing all of these things and thinking for each one of them what kinds of privilege might one think there is. One thing that he thinks is as part of the distinction between the descriptive and explanatory vocabulary and the metalinguistic stuff, and another place where he's together with the later Wittgenstein, is that meanings, rules, norms aren't going to be in this. They're not going to be on the real side of this. Science is never going to give us semantics, and it won't, because it won't give us pragmatics. You couldn't understand meanings and conceptual contents without understanding the rules that govern the positions and the moves functionally. And he thinks that's not, that's a matter of stating the rules, and that's not a descriptive or explanatory use of language. So, though that's an environment that's presupposed by the scientific uses of language, that part of it stays out. We're supposed to take over the scientific descriptive vocabulary in our everyday lives. That's the picture at the end of PSIM, which he says, of course it's a fantasy, but this is the fantasy that we come to use, including in our observation reports, the scientific vocabulary. But we're going to be doing these other things that are not describing and explaining with the language. You can't scientifically study what sets us apart as discursive creatures. That's merely to describe the skeletons of the rules, not the implicit norms that the rules are making explicit. And this is fundamentally to, and as I say, later Wittgenstein, here, that's why philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. And it's why Wittgenstein, at least, explicitly prohibits postulating unobservables in thinking about normative stuff. That would be doing science with them. Sellars never explicitly says that in codifying rules, for instance, we can't postulate unobservables because that would be doing science. But he does make the distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image based on that. Anyway, one of the ways he draws it is based on that. And in a critical mode, I wonder whether that's so. Whether, in fact, there's no prospect. Can we know, sort of from our armchairs here, that there's no prospect of getting a scientific grip on these normative phenomena, where that would mean postulating unobservables as part of an expressive project rather than a descriptive project. It's interesting to me from that point of view that when he says science, he means natural science. And I wonder why that's so, because it seems to me one looks at groups and their practices, and social science seems like a way to do that. But this division, rather than the categorical, so this sort of way of thinking about the primacy of the theoretical deliverances of natural science, that's the hill he claims for himself as a Kantian, rather than the real advance that it seems to me he makes in developing Kant's ideas, which is this metalinguistic expressivist version of the categories. Now, wanting to make something of the phenomena-noumena distinction looking at science, it doesn't make my heart beat fast as a program, but it's not silly. He didn't bring it off, I think, for the reasons I've suggested, but it belongs up there as an idea about how to make something of Kant in contemporary terms, alongside at least, say, the picture of Kant's transcendental psychology as cognitive science avant la lettre that Patricia Kitcher develops, or the view that particularly the Marburg neo-Kantians had, that Kant was fundamentally a philosopher of science, and that has been developed in our own time, particularly by Michael Friedman, with the crucial qualification that Kant was a brilliant philosopher of 18th century science. And Friedman thinks that makes most of his philosophy of science actually not helpful to us today. It was a very different science. But I guess the last thought I want to present is that the people who more than anybody else were the brilliant philosophers of 19th century science were the American pragmatists, who looked not to Newtonian physics, but to the new 19th century sciences, to statistical modes of explanation that had won their spurs in statistical mechanics and statistical thermodynamics, but were then applied in the new social sciences, in sociology and political science, as one of their models. And the second, Darwinian selectional evolutionary theory, which it was the particular sort of founding idea of American pragmatism to see an identity of form of explanation between Darwinian selectional evolutionary explanations and individual learning in late 19th century psychology. So looking to Darwinian biology and to selection mechanisms as a notion of learning. This is why the key concept for Peirce is the concept of habit. And that they used their philosophical understanding of these new 19th century sciences, principally biology and psychology, to get a version of empiricism and a version of naturalism that worked together much better than either the traditional or the Vienna Circle kind did. Honorable mention should also go to Ernst Cassirer, who drew his philosophical inspiration from his understanding of the development of 19th century German biology. In particular, what he was impressed with was the way in which the notion of structure, sort of studied in anatomy, was pushed out of place and replaced by a notion of function and the study of physiology. His book Substance and Function is the locus classicus for this. He's running the same sort of line that the American pragmatists did. Both of those got shunted aside and in effect made no difference in intellectual history. When philosophy of science was born or reborn in the 20th century by the Vienna Circle, it was by physicists and mathematicians who were working with the new 20th century physics, but who were completely innocent of these 19th century developments in biology and in social sciences that were so important to these other figures. Now, I think that we're still awaiting the synthesis of the lessons that these folks learned from 19th century science with the Vienna Circle people that sort of gave us the philosophy of science we have today. And it seems to me that what Sellars needed to turn the crank one more time on his thinking about science here was the lessons of those philosophers of 19th century science. But maybe that's asking too much. Okay, well, that's my sort of overview of this, and I just hope, I don't know, I find it an inspiring picture of his thought of what can be done, and I have the sense that many people in Anglophone philosophy have a sort of fin de siècle view. Well, we sort of know all the general outlines of things, and it's just a matter of filling in some of the details. And I think of all the loose ends and interesting ideas that Sellars has that we haven't sort of squeezed all the juice out of yet. And I'm inspired by that, so I hope some things at least struck you like that. Okay.